Hachette Audio presents Dominion, How the Christian Revolution Remade the World. Written by Tom Holland. Read by Mark Meadows with an introduction read by the author.
Dominion. Love, and do as you will. St. Augustine. That you feel something to be right may have its cause in your never having thought much about yourself and having blindly accepted what has been labelled right since your childhood. Friedrich Nietzsche. All you need is love. John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Some 3 or 4 decades before the birth of Christ, Rome's first heated swimming pool was built on the Esquiline Hill. The location, just outside the city's ancient walls, was a prime one. In time, it would become a showcase for some of the wealthiest people in the world, an immense expanse of luxury villas and parks. But there was a reason why the land beyond the Esquiline Gate had been left undeveloped for so long. For many centuries, from the very earliest days of Rome, it had been a place of the dead. When labourers first began work on the swimming pool, a corpse stench still hung in the air. A ditch, once part of the city's venerable defensive system, was littered with the carcasses of those too poor to be laid to rest in tombs. Here was where dead slaves, once they had been slung out from their narrow cells, were dumped. Vultures, flocking in such numbers that they were known as the birds of the Esquiline, picked the bodies clean. Nowhere else in Rome was the process of gentrification quite so dramatic. The marble fittings, the tinkling fountains, the perfumed flower beds, all were raised on the backs of the dead. The process of reclamation, though, took a long time. Decades on from the first development of the region beyond the Esquiline Gate, vultures were still to be seen there, wheeling over a site named the Sessorium. This remained what it had always been, the place set aside for the execution of slaves. It was not, unlike the arenas in which criminals were put to death for the delectation of cheering crowds, a place of glamour. Exposed to public view like slabs of meat hung from a market stall, troublesome slaves were nailed to crosses. Even as seedlings imported from exotic lands began to be planted across the emerging parkland of the Esquiline, these bare trees remained as a token of its sinister past. No death was more excruciating, more contemptible than crucifixion. To be hung naked, long in agony, swelling with ugly wheals on shoulders and chest, helpless to beat away the clamorous birds. Such a fate, Roman intellectuals agreed, was the worst imaginable. This, in turn, was what rendered it so suitable a punishment for slaves. Lacking such a sanction, the entire order of the city might fall apart. Luxury and splendour such as Rome could boast were dependent, in the final reckoning, on keeping those who sustained it in their place. After all, we have slaves drawn from every corner of the world in our households, practising strange customs and foreign cults, or none, and it is only by means of terror that we can hope to coerce such scum. Nevertheless, while the salutary effect of crucifixion on those who might otherwise threaten the order of the state was taken for granted, Roman attitudes to the punishment were shot through with ambivalence. Naturally, if it were to serve as a deterrent, it needed to be public. Nothing spoke more eloquently of a failed revolt than the sight of hundreds upon hundreds of corpse-hung crosses, whether lining a highway or else massed before a rebellious city, the hills all around it stripped bare of their trees. Even in peacetime, executioners would make a spectacle of their victims by suspending them in a variety of inventive ways, one perhaps upside down, with his head towards the ground, another with a stake driven through his genitals, another attached by his arms to a yoke. Yet in the exposure of the crucified to the public gaze, there lurked a paradox. So foul was the carrion reek of their disgrace that many felt tainted even by viewing a crucifixion. The Romans, for all that they had adopted the punishment as the supreme penalty, refused to countenance the possibility that it might have originated with them. Only a people famed for their barbarousness and cruelty could ever have devised such a torture. The Persians, perhaps, or the Assyrians, or the Gauls. Everything about the practice of nailing a man to a cross, a crux, was repellent. Why, the very word is harsh on our ears. It was this disgust that crucifixion uniquely inspired, which explained why, when slaves were condemned to death, they were executed in the meanest, wretchedest stretch of land beyond the city walls, and why, when Rome burst its ancient limits, only the world's most exotic and aromatic plants could serve to mask the taint. It was also why, despite the ubiquity of crucifixion across the Roman world, few cared to think much about it. Order, the order loved by the gods and upheld by magistrates vested with the full authority of the greatest power on earth, was what counted, not the elimination of such vermin as presumed to challenge it. Criminals broken on implements of torture, who was such filth to concern men of breeding and civility? Some deaths were so vile, so squalid, that it was best to draw a veil across them entirely. The surprise, then, is less that we should have so few detailed descriptions in ancient literature of what a crucifixion might actually involve, than that we should have any at all. The corpses of the crucified, once they had first provided pickings for hungry birds, tended to be flung into a common grave. In Italy, undertakers dressed in red, ringing bells as they went, would drag them there on hooks. Oblivion, like the loose earth scattered over their tortured bodies, would then entomb them. This was a part of their fate. Nevertheless, amid the general silence, there is one major exception which proves the rule. 4 detailed accounts of the process by which a man might be sentenced to the cross and then suffer his punishment have survived from antiquity. Remarkably, they all describe the same execution, a crucifixion that took place some 60 or 70 years after the building of the first heated swimming pool in Rome. The location, though, was not the Esquiline, but another hill, outside the walls of Jerusalem, Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. The victim, a Jew by the name of Jesus, a wandering preacher from an obscure town named Nazareth, in a region north of Jerusalem named Galilee, had been convicted of a capital offence against Roman order. The 4 earliest accounts of his execution, written some decades after his death, specify what this meant in practice. The condemned man, after his sentencing, was handed over to soldiers to be flogged. Next, because he had claimed to be the King of the Jews, his guards mocked him and spat on him, and set a crown of thorns on his head. Only then, bruised and bloodied, was he led out on his final journey. Hauling his cross as he went, he stumbled his way through Jerusalem, a spectacle and an admonition to all who saw him, and onwards, along the road to Golgotha. There, nails were driven into his hands and feet, and he was crucified. After his death, a spear was jabbed into his side. There is no reason to doubt the essentials of this narrative. Even the most sceptical historians have tended to accept them. The death of Jesus of Nazareth on the cross is an established fact, one of them has written, arguably the only established fact about him. Certainly, his sufferings were nothing exceptional. Pain and humiliation and the protracted horror of the most wretched of deaths. These, over the course of Roman history, were the common lot of multitudes. Decidedly not the common lot of multitudes, however, was the fate of Jesus' corpse. Lowered from the cross, it was spared a common grave. Claimed by a wealthy admirer, it was prepared reverently for burial, laid in a tomb, and left behind a heavy boulder. Such, at any rate, is the report of all four of the earliest narratives of Jesus' death, narratives that in Greek were called euangelia, good news, and would come to be known in English as Gospels. The accounts are not implausible. Certainly we know from archaeological evidence that the corpse of a crucified man might indeed, on occasion, be granted dignified burial in the ossuaries beyond the walls of Jerusalem. Altogether more startling, though, not to say unprecedented, were the stories of what happened next. That women, going to the tomb, had found the entrance stone rolled away. That Jesus, over the course of the next 40 days, had appeared to his followers not as a ghost or a reanimated corpse, but resurrected into a new and glorious form. That he had ascended into heaven and was destined to come again. Time would see him hailed, not just as a man, but as a god. By enduring the most agonizing fate imaginable, he had conquered death itself. Therefore God has highly exalted him, and bestowed on him the name which is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven and on earth and under the earth. The utter strangeness of all this for the vast majority of people in the Roman world did not lie in the notion that a mortal might become divine. The border between the heavenly and the earthly was widely held to be permeable. In Egypt, the oldest of monarchies, kings had been objects of worship for unfathomable eons. In Greece, stories were told of a hero god by the name of Heracles, a muscle-bound monster slayer who, after a lifetime of spectacular feats, had been swept up from the flames of his own pyre to join the immortals. Among the Romans, a similar tale was told of Romulus, the founder of their city. In the decades before the crucifixion of Jesus, the pace of such promotions into the ranks of the gods had begun to quicken. So vast had the scope of Roman power become that any man who succeeded in making himself its master was liable to seem less human than divine. The ascent into heaven of one of those, a warlord by the name of Julius Caesar, had been heralded by the blaze across the skies of a fiery-tailed star. That of a second, Caesar's adopted son, who had won for himself the name of Augustus, by a spirit seen rising, just as Heracles had done, from a funeral pyre. Even skeptics who scorned the possibility that a fellow mortal might truly become a god were happy to concede its civic value. For the human spirit that believes itself to be of divine origin will thereby be emboldened in the undertaking of mighty deeds, more energetic in accomplishing them, and by its freedom from care rendered more successful in carrying them out. Divinity, then, was for the very greatest of the great, for victors and heroes and kings. Its measure was the power to torture one's enemies, not to suffer it oneself, to nail them to the rocks of a mountain, or to turn them into spiders, or to blind and crucify them after conquering the world. That a man who had himself been crucified might be hailed as a god could not help but be seen by people everywhere across the Roman world as scandalous, obscene, grotesque. The ultimate offensiveness, though, was to one particular people, Jesus' own. The Jews, unlike their rulers, did not believe that a man might become a god. They believed that there was only the one almighty eternal deity. Creator of the heavens and the earth, he was worshipped by them as the Most High God, the Lord of hosts, the Master of all the earth. Empires were his to order, mountains to melt like wax. That such a God, of all gods, might have had a son, and that this son, suffering the fate of a slave, might have been tortured to death on a cross, were claims as stupefying as they were, to most Jews, repellent. No more shocking a reversal of their most devoutly held assumptions could possibly have been imagined. Not merely blasphemy, it was madness. Even those who did come to acknowledge Jesus as Christos, the anointed one of the Lord God, might flinch at staring the manner of his death full in the face. Christians, as they were called, were as wise to the connotations of crucifixion as anyone. The mystery of the cross, which summons us to God, is something despised and dishonourable. So wrote Justin, the foremost Christian apologist of his generation, a century and a half after the birth of Jesus. The torture of the Son of the Most High God was a horror simply too shocking to be portrayed in visual form. Scribes copying the Gospels might on occasion draw above the Greek word for cross delicate pictograms that hinted at the crucified Christ, but otherwise it was left to sorcerers or satirists to illustrate his execution. Yet this, to many across the Roman world, was not as deep a paradox as perhaps it might have seemed. So profound were some mysteries that mortals had no choice but to keep them veiled. The naked radiance of the gods was far too dazzling for the human eye. No one, by contrast, had been blinded by the spectacle of the Son of the Most High God being tortured to death. But Christians, although accustomed to make the sign of the cross as a gesture of piety, and to contemplate with wide-eyed reverence the gospel accounts of their Saviour's sufferings, seem to have shrunk from seeing them represented in physical form. Only centuries after the death of Jesus, by which time, astonishingly, even the Caesars had been brought to acknowledge him as Christ, did his execution at last start to emerge as an acceptable theme for artists. By AD 400, the cross was ceasing to be viewed as something shameful. Banned as a punishment decades earlier by Constantine, the first Christian emperor, crucifixion had come to serve the Roman people as an emblem of triumph over sin and death. An artist, carving the scene out of ivory, might represent Jesus in the skimpy loincloth of an athlete, no less muscled than any of the ancient gods. Even as the western half of the empire began to slip away from the rule of the Caesars and fall to barbarian invaders, so in the eastern half, where Roman power endured, the cross provided assurance to an embattled people that victory would ultimately be theirs. In Christ's agonies had been the index of his defeat of evil. This was why, triumphant even on the implement of his torture, he was never shown as suffering pain. His expression was one of serenity. It proclaimed him Lord of the universe. So it was, in an empire that, although today we call it Byzantine, never ceased to insist that it was Roman, a corpse came to serve as an icon of majesty. Byzantium, though, was not the only Christian realm. In the Latin-speaking West, a millennium and more after the birth of Christ, a fresh revolution was brewing. Increasingly, there were Christians who, rather than keeping the brute horror of crucifixion from their gaze, yearned instead to fix their eyes fully upon it. Why, O my soul, did you fail to be there, to be stabbed by a sword of bitter grief, that you could not endure the piercing of your Saviour's side by a spear? Why could you not bear to see the nails violate the hands and feet of your Creator? This prayer, written sometime around AD 1070, was not just to the God who reigned in glory on high, but to the condemned criminal he had been when he suffered his humiliating death. Its author, a brilliant scholar from northern Italy by the name of Anselm, was a man of noble birth, a correspondent of countesses, an associate of kings. Such it was to be a prince of the church, the ecclesia or assembly of the Christian people. Anselm was a man who combined birth, ability, and a famous name. Nevertheless, even as he laboured to sway the destiny of Christendom, he could not help but find in his own eminence a cause of dread. So upset was he when appointed to lead the English church that he promptly suffered a spectacular nosebleed. The very name of private property was to him a thing of horror. Seeing a cornered hare, he burst into tears and bade the terrified animal be set free. No matter how high in the affairs of the world he rose, he never forgot that it was in lowliness and nakedness and persecution that his Saviour had redeemed him. In his prayer to the crucified Christ, copied as it was and read across the whole of the Latin West, Anselm articulated a new and momentous understanding of the Christian God, one in which the emphasis was laid not upon his triumph, but upon his suffering humanity. The Jesus portrayed by medieval artists, twisted, bloody, dying, was a victim of crucifixion such as his original executioners would have recognized, no longer serene and victorious, but racked by agony, just as any tortured slave would have been. The response to the spectacle, however, was far removed from the mingled revulsion and disdain that had typified that of the ancients to crucifixion. Men and women, when they looked upon an image of their Lord fixed to the cross, upon the nails smashed through the tendons and bone of his feet, upon the arms stretched so tightly as to appear torn from their sockets, upon the slump of his thorn-crowned head onto his chest, did not feel contempt, but rather compassion and pity and fear. There was certainly no lack of Christians in medieval Europe to identify with the sufferings of their God. Rich still trampled down poor. Gibbets stood on hills. The church itself, thanks in large part to the exertions of men like Anselm, was able to lay claim to the ancient primacy of Rome, and uphold it, what was more. And yet, for all that, something fundamental had indeed changed. Patience in tribulation, offering the other cheek, praying for one's enemies, loving those who hate us. Such were the Christian virtues as defined by Anselm, all derived from the recorded sayings of Jesus himself. No Christians, then, not even the most callous or unheeding, could ignore them without some measure of reproof from their consciences. That the Son of God, born of a woman and sentenced to the death of a slave, had perished unrecognized by his judges, was a reflection fit to give pause to even the haughtiest monarch. This awareness, enshrined as it was in the very heart of medieval Christianity, could not help but lodge in its consciousness a visceral and momentous suspicion that God was closer to the weak than to the mighty, to the poor than to the rich. Any beggar, any criminal, might be Christ. So the last will be first, and the first last. To the Roman aristocrats who, in the decades before the birth of Jesus, first began to colonize the Esquiline Hill with their marble fittings and their flower beds, such a sentiment would have seemed grotesque. And yet, it had come to pass. Nowhere bore more spectacular witness to this than Rome itself. In 1601, in a church that had originally been built to exorcise the ghost of Nero, a particularly flamboyant and malignant Caesar, a painting was installed that paid homage to the outcast origins of the city's Christian order. The artist, a young man from Milan by the name of Caravaggio, had been commissioned to paint a crucifixion, not of Christ himself, but of his leading disciple. Peter, a fisherman who, according to the Gospels, had abandoned his boat and nets to follow Jesus, was said to have become the overseer, the episkopos, or bishop, of the first Christians of Rome, before being put to death by Nero. Since Peter's execution, more than 200 men had held the bishopric, an office that brought with it a claim to primacy over the entire church and the honorary title of papas, or father, pope. Over the course of the 15 centuries and more that had followed Peter's death, the authority of the popes had waxed and waned, but it remained, in the lifetime of Caravaggio, a formidable thing. The artist, however, knew better than to celebrate its pomp, its splendour, its wealth. The earthly greatness of the papacy was turned literally on its head. Peter, the story went, had demanded to be crucified upside down, so as not to share in the fate of his Lord. And Caravaggio, choosing as his theme the very moment when the heavy cross was levered upwards, portrayed the first pope as he had authentically been, as a peasant. No ancient artist would have thought to honour a Caesar by representing him as Caravaggio represented Peter, tortured, humiliated, stripped almost bare. And yet, in the city of the Caesars, it was a man broken to such a fate who was honoured as the keeper of the keys of the kingdom of heaven. The last had indeed become first. The relationship of Christianity to the world that gave birth to it is, then, paradoxical. The faith is at once the most enduring legacy of classical antiquity and the index of its utter transformation. Formed of a great confluence of traditions, Persian and Jewish, Greek and Roman, it has long survived the collapse of the empire from which it first emerged, to become, in the words of one Jewish scholar, the most powerful of hegemonic cultural systems in the history of the world. In the Middle Ages, no civilization in Eurasia was as congruent with a single dominant set of beliefs as was the Latin West with its own distinctive form of Christianity. Elsewhere, whether in the lands of Islam, or in India, or in China, there were various understandings of the divine and numerous institutions that served to define them. But in Europe, in the lands that acknowledged the primacy of the Pope, there was only the occasional community of Jews to disrupt the otherwise total monopoly of the Roman Church. Such exclusivity was sternly guarded. Those who disturbed it and refused to repent might expect to be silenced, expelled, or put to death. A church that worshipped a god executed by heedless authorities presided over what has aptly been termed a persecuting society. Here, in the conviction that beliefs serve to define a man or woman, was yet a further index of the transformative impact of the Christian Revolution. That Christians had been willing to die as witnesses for their beliefs, as martyrs, was precisely what had marked them out to the Roman authorities as sinister and aberrant. All that, though, had changed. Time had seen the subversive prevail. In medieval Christendom, the bones of martyrs were treasured, and it was the Church that patrolled belief. To be human was to be Christian. To be Christian was to believe. Well might the Roman Church have termed itself Catholic, universal. There was barely a rhythm of life that it did not define. From dawn to dusk, from midsummer to the depths of winter, from the hour of their birth to the very last drawing of their breath, the men and women of medieval Europe absorbed its assumptions into their bones. Even when, in the century before Caravaggio, Catholic Christendom began to fragment and new forms of Christianity to emerge, the conviction of Europeans that their faith was universal, Catholic, remained deep-rooted. It inspired them in their exploration of continents undreamed of by their forefathers, in their conquest of those that they were able to seize and reconsecrate as a promised land, in their attempt to convert the inhabitants of those that they were not. Whether in Korea, or in Tierra del Fuego, in Alaska, or in New Zealand, the cross on which Jesus had been tortured to death came to serve as the most globally recognized symbol of a God that there has ever been. Thou hast rebuked the nations. Thou hast destroyed the wicked. Thou hast blotted out their name for ever and ever. The man who greeted the news of the Japanese surrender in 1945 by quoting scripture and offering up praise to Christ was not Truman, not Churchill, not de Gaulle, but the Chinese leader, Chiang Kai-shek. Even in the 21st century, as the tide of Western dominance palpably retreats, assumptions bred of Europe's ancestral faith continue to structure the way that the world organizes itself. Whether in North Korea or in the command structures of jihadi terrorist cells, there are few so ideologically opposed to the West that they are not sometimes obliged to employ the international dating system. Whenever they do so, they are subliminally reminded of the claims made by Christianity about the birth of Jesus. Time itself has been Christianized. How was it that a cult inspired by the execution of an obscure criminal in a long-vanished empire, came to exercise such a transformative and enduring influence on the world? To attempt an answer to this question, as I do in this book, is not to write a history of Christianity. Rather than provide a panoramic survey of its evolution, I have sought instead to trace the currents of Christian influence that have spread most widely and been most enduring into the present day. That is why, although I have written extensively about the Eastern and Orthodox churches elsewhere and find them themes of immense wonder and fascination, I have chosen not to trace their development beyond antiquity. My ambition is hubristic enough as it is, to explore how we in the West came to be what we are and to think the way that we do. The moral and imaginative upheaval that saw Jesus enshrined as a god by the same imperial order that had tortured him to death did not bring to an end the capacity of Christianity for inspiring profound transformations in societies. Quite the opposite. Already, by the time that Anselm died in 1109, Latin Christendom had been set upon a course so distinctive that what today we term the West is less its heir than its continuation. Certainly, to dream of a world transformed by a Reformation or an Enlightenment or a revolution is nothing exclusively modern. Rather, it is to dream as medieval visionaries dreamed, to dream in the manner of a Christian. Today, at a time of seismic geopolitical realignment, when our values are proving to be not nearly as universal as some of us had assumed them to be, the need to recognise just how culturally contingent they are is more pressing than ever. To live in a Western country is to live in a society still utterly saturated by Christian concepts and assumptions. This is no less true for Jews or Muslims than it is for Catholics or Protestants. 2,000 years on from the birth of Christ, it does not require a belief that he rose from the dead to be stamped by the formidable, indeed the inescapable, influence of Christianity. Whether it be the conviction that the workings of conscience are the surest determinants of good law, or that church and state exist as distinct entities, or that polygamy is unacceptable, its trace elements are to be found everywhere in the West. Even to write about it in a Western language is to use words shot through with Christian connotations. Religion, secular, atheist. None of these are neutral. All, though they derive from the classical past, come freighted with the legacy of Christendom. Fail to appreciate this, and the risk is always of anachronism. The West, increasingly empty though the pews may be, remains firmly moored to its Christian past. There are those who will rejoice at this proposition, and there are those who will be appalled by it. Christianity may be the most enduring and influential legacy of the ancient world, and its emergence the single most transformative development in Western history, but it is also the most challenging for a historian to write about. In the West, and particularly in the United States, it remains easily the dominant faith. Worldwide, over 2 billion people, almost a third of the planet's population, subscribe to it. Unlike Osiris, or Zeus, or Odin, the Christian God still goes strong. The tradition of interpreting the past as the tracing of patterns upon time by his forefinger, a tradition that reaches back to the very beginnings of the faith, is far from dead. The crucifixion of Jesus, to all those many millions who worship him as the Son of the Lord God, the creator of heaven and earth, was not merely an event in history, but the very pivot around which the cosmos turns. Historians, however, no matter how alert they may be to the potency of this understanding and to the way in which it has swayed the course of the world's affairs, are not in the business of debating whether it is actually true. Instead, they study Christianity for what it can reveal, not about God, but about the affairs of humanity. No less than any other aspect of culture and society, beliefs are presumed to be of mortal origin and shaped by the passage of time. To look to the supernatural for explanations of what happened in the past is to engage in apologetics, a perfectly reputable pursuit, but not history as today, in the modern West, it has come to be understood. Yet if historians of Christianity must negotiate faith, so also must they negotiate doubt. It is not only believers whose interpretation of Christian history is liable to be something deeply personal to them. The same can be equally true of skeptics. In 1860, in one of the first public discussions of Charles Darwin's recently published On the Origin of Species, the Bishop of Oxford notoriously mocked the theory that human beings might be the product of evolution. Now, though, the boot is on the other foot. It is the case that since we are all 21st century people, we all subscribe to a pretty widespread consensus of what's right and what's wrong. So Richard Dawkins, the world's most evangelical atheist, has declared. To argue that, in the West, the pretty widespread consensus of what's right and what's wrong derives principally from Christian teachings and presumptions can risk seeming, in societies of many faiths and none, almost offensive. Even in America, where Christianity remains far more vibrant a force than it does in Europe, growing numbers have come to view the West's ancestral faith as something outmoded, a relic of earlier, more superstitious times. Just as the Bishop of Oxford refused to consider that he might be descended from an ape, so now are many in the West reluctant to contemplate that their values, and even their very lack of belief, might be traceable back to Christian origins. I assert this with a measure of confidence because, until quite recently, I shared in this reluctance. Although as a boy I was taken every Sunday to church by my mother and would solemnly say my prayers at night, I found myself at an early age experiencing what I can now recognise as having been an almost Victorian crisis of faith. I still remember the shock I felt when, at Sunday school one day, I opened a children's Bible and found an illustration on its first page of Adam and Eve with a brachiosaur. Respectful of Bible stories I may have been, but of one thing, to my deep regret, I was certain. No human being had ever seen a sauropod. That the teacher seemed not to care about this error only compounded my sense of outrage and perplexity. Had there been dinosaurs in the Garden of Eden? My teacher seemed neither to know nor to care. A faint shadow of doubt had been brought to darken my confidence in the truth of what I was being taught about the Christian faith. With time, it darkened further still. My obsession with dinosaurs, glamorous, ferocious, extinct, evolved seamlessly into an obsession with ancient empires. When I read the Bible, the focus of my fascination was less the children of Israel or Jesus and his disciples than their adversaries, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Romans. In a similar manner, although I vaguely continued to believe in God, I found him infinitely less charismatic than the gods of the Greeks, Apollo, Athena, Dionysus. I liked the way that they did not lay down laws or condemn other deities as demons. I liked their rock star glamour. As a result, by the time I came to read Edward Gibbon and his great history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, I was more than ready to accept his interpretation of the triumph of Christianity, that it had ushered in an age of superstition and credulity. My childhood instinct to see the biblical God as the po-faced enemy of liberty and fun was rationalised. The defeat of paganism had ushered in the reign of Nobodaddy, and of all the various crusaders, inquisitors, and black-hatted Puritans who had served as his acolytes. Colour and excitement had been drained from the world. "Thou hast conquered, O pale Galilean," wrote the Victorian poet Algernon Charles Swinburne, echoing the apocryphal lament of Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor of Rome. "The world has grown grey from thy breath." Instinctively, I agreed. Yet over the course of the past 2 decades, my perspective has changed. When I came to write my first works of history, I chose as my themes the two periods that had always most stirred and moved me as a child: the Persian invasions of Greece and the last decades of the Roman Republic. The years that I spent writing these twin studies of the classical world, living intimately in the company of Leonidas and of Julius Caesar, of the hoplites who had died at Thermopylae and of the legionaries who had crossed the Rubicon, only confirmed me in my fascination. For Sparta and Rome, even when subjected to the minutest historical inquiry, retained their glamour as apex predators. They continued to stalk my imaginings as they had always done, like a great white shark, like a tiger, like a tyrannosaur. Yet giant carnivores, however wondrous, are by their nature terrifying. The more years I spent immersed in the study of classical antiquity, so the more alien I increasingly found it. The values of Leonidas, whose people had practiced a peculiarly murderous form of eugenics and trained their young to kill uppity Untermenschen by night, were nothing that I recognised as my own. Nor were those of Caesar, who was reported to have killed 1 million Gauls and enslaved 1 million more. It was not just the extremes of callousness that unsettled me, but the complete lack of any sense that the poor or the weak might have the slightest intrinsic value. Why did I find this disturbing? Because, in my morals and ethics, I was not a Spartan or a Roman at all. That my belief in God had faded over the course of my teenage years did not mean that I had ceased to be Christian. For a millennium and more, the civilization into which I had been born was Christendom. Assumptions that I had grown up with about how a society should properly be organized and the principles that it should uphold were not bred of classical antiquity, still less of human nature, but very distinctively of that civilization's Christian past. So profound has been the impact of Christianity on the development of Western civilization that it has come to be hidden from view. It is the incomplete revolutions which are remembered. The fate of those which triumph is to be taken for granted. The ambition of dominion is to trace the course of what one Christian, writing in the 3rd century AD, termed the flood tide of Christ. How the belief that the Son of the one God of the Jews had been tortured to death on a cross came to be so enduringly and widely held that today most of us in the West are dulled to just how scandalous it originally was. This book explores what it was that made Christianity so subversive and disruptive, how completely it came to saturate the mindset of Latin Christendom, and why, in a West that is often doubtful of religion's claims, so many of its instincts remain, for good and ill, thoroughly Christian. It is, to coin a phrase, the greatest story ever told.
Antiquity. Chapter 1. Athens. 479 BC, the Hellespont. At one of the narrowest points on the Hellespont, the thin channel of water that snakes from the Aegean up towards the Black Sea and separates Europe from Asia, a promontory known as the Dog's Tail extended from the European shore. Here, 480 years before the birth of Christ, a feat so astonishing as to seem the work of a god had been completed. Twin pontoon bridges, stretching from the Asian shore to the tip of the Dog's Tail, had yoked the two continents together. That none but a monarch of infinite resources could possibly have tamed the currents of the sea in so imperious a manner went without saying. Xerxes, the king of Persia, ruled the largest empire that the world had ever seen. From the Aegean to the Hindu Kush, all the teeming hordes of Asia marched at his command. Going to war, he could summon forces that were said to drink entire rivers dry. Few had doubted, watching Xerxes cross the Hellespont, that the whole continent beyond would soon be his. 1 year on, the bridges were gone. So too were Xerxes' hopes of conquering Europe. Invading Greece, he had captured Athens, but the torching of the city was to prove the high point of his campaign. Defeat by sea and land had forced a Persian retreat. Xerxes himself had returned to Asia. On the Hellespont, where command of the strait had been entrusted to a governor named Artaictes, there was particular alarm. He knew himself, in the wake of the debacle in Greece, ominously exposed. Sure enough, late in the summer of 479, a squadron of Athenian ships came gliding up the Hellespont. When they moored beside the Dog's Tail, Artaictes first barricaded himself inside the nearest stronghold, and then, after a lengthy siege, made a break for safety, accompanied by his son. Despite a successful escape in the dead of night, they did not get far. Hunted down, father and son were soon being hauled back in chains to the Dog's Tail. There, on the furthermost tip of the promontory, Artaictes was fixed by his Athenian captors to a wooden board and hung from it. Then, before his very eyes, they stoned his son to death. Artaictes himself was left to a much more lingering end. How had his executioners succeeded in keeping him attached to the upright plank? In Athens, criminals convicted of particularly heinous crimes might be fastened to an instrument of torture called the apotympanismos, a board furnished with shackles for securing the neck, wrists, and ankles. There is no suggestion, however, that this particular device was implied by the killers of Artaictes. Instead, in the one account of his death we are told that he was fastened to the board with passaloi, pins. Specifically, the word used by Herodotus is prospassalusantes, fastened with pins. The executioners, forcing their victim onto his back, had evidently driven spikes through his living flesh, hammering them deep into the wood. Bone would have rubbed and scraped against iron as the board was then levered erect. Artaictes, watching as his son was left a pulped and broken mess, would also have been able to look up to the skies and see the birds there wheeling, impatient to settle on him, to feast on his eyes. Death, when it finally claimed him, would have come as a release. His captors, in making such a protracted spectacle of Artaictes' suffering, were also making a statement. To execute him on the very spot where Xerxes had first stepped onto European soil broadcast an unmistakable message. To humiliate the great king's servant was to humiliate the great king himself. The Greeks, who had long lived in the shadow of Persia, had good reason to regard it as the home of ingenious tortures. It was the Persians, they believed, who had first initiated the practice of exposing criminals on stakes or crosses, so that humiliation compounded the agonies of death. Certainly, the punishments inflicted on those who defied the royal dignity were as excruciating as they were minatory. Some 40 years before Xerxes' invasion of Greece, his father Darius had dealt with those who disputed his right to the throne by torturing them in the most public manner possible. Entire forests of stakes had been erected, on which his rivals, writhing and screaming as they felt the wood start to penetrate their innards, had been impaled. I cut off both his nose and his ears, and put out one of his eyes, and kept him bound at my palace entrance, where all could see him. So Darius had boasted, detailing his treatment of one particularly noxious rebel. Then I had him impaled. Not every victim of the great king's anger, though, was necessarily suspended and exposed as he died. The Greeks reported in hushed tones of disgust one particularly revolting torture, the scaphi, or trough. The executioner, after placing his victim inside a boat or hollowed-out tree trunk, would then attach a second one over the top of it, so that only the wretched man's head, hands, and feet were left sticking out. Fed continuously with rich food, the criminal would have no choice but to lie in his own excrement. Smeared all over with honey, he would find himself powerless to brush away the buzzing flies. Worms and swarms of maggots were bred of the rottenness and the putrefaction of the excrement, and these, eating away at his body, bored into his intestines. The victim would finally expire only once his flesh and organs had been almost entirely consumed. One man, so it was reliably reported, had endured the scaffy for 17 days before finally breathing his last. Yet, cruel though such a torture might be, it was not wantonly so. The Greeks, when they charged the great king with heedless displays of despotism, mistook for barbarous savagery the sense of responsibility that characterized his concern for justice. In truth, from the perspective of the Persian court, it was the Greeks who were the barbarians. Although the great king was content to allow his subject peoples to uphold their own laws, provided, of course, that they were dutifully submissive, he never doubted the cosmic character of his own prerogatives and responsibilities. "By the favour of Ahura Mazda am I king," declared Darius. "Ahura Mazda bestowed kingship upon me." Greatest of the gods, the wise Lord, who had created both the heavens and the earth, and clad himself in the crystalline beauty of the skies above the snows and sands of Iran, he was the only patron whom Darius acknowledged. The justice the great king gave to his subjects was not of mortal origin, but derived directly from the Lord of Light. "The man who is loyal I reward, the man who is faithless I punish. It is by the favour of Ahura Mazda that people respect the order I uphold." This conviction, that the rule of a king might be as beneficent as a god's, was not original to Darius. It reached back to the very beginning of things. To the west of Iran, watered by two mighty rivers, stretched the mudflats of the region known to the Greeks as Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Here, in cities older by far than the Persians, monarchs had long been in the habit of thanking the gods for their assistance in administering justice. 1,000 years and more before Darius, a king named Hammurabi had declared himself charged with a divine mandate to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, and to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak. The influence of this claim, that a king best served his people by providing them with equity, was to prove an enduring one. Babylon, the city ruled by Hammurabi, regarded itself as the capital of the world. This was not mere wishful thinking. As wealthy as it was sophisticated, the metropolis had long attracted superlatives. Although its greatness had ebbed and flowed over the course of the centuries, the grandeur and antiquity of its traditions were grudgingly acknowledged across Mesopotamia. Even in Assyria, a land to the north of Babylon, and which, until the collapse of its ferociously militarist regime in 612 BC, had repeatedly launched punitive expeditions against the great city, its kings echoed the pretensions of Hammurabi. They, too, claimed a dazzling and intimidating status for their rulings. "The word of the king," so one of them ringingly declared, "is as perfect as that of the gods." In 539 BC, when Babylon was conquered by the Persians, just as Assyria 7 decades previously had been conquered by the Babylonians, the gods of the vanquished metropolis had not hesitated to hail its new master as their favourite. Cyrus, the founder of his people's greatness, and whose capture of the world's largest city had set the seal on a lifetime of astonishing victories, had graciously accepted their patronage. The Persian king boasted of having entered Babylon at their explicit invitation, of having restored their temples, of having cared daily for their worship. Cyrus, as deft a propagandist as he was effective a military commander, knew full well what he was doing. Starting his reign as the king of an obscure and upstart people, he ended it as lord of the largest agglomeration of territories that the world had ever seen, and on a scale certainly that far exceeded the wildest fantasies of any Assyrian or Babylonian monarch. Yet Cyrus, when he looked to promote himself as a global ruler, had little option but to look to the heritage of Mesopotamia. Nowhere else in his dominions had offered him a model of kingship so rooted in antiquity, so burnished by self-satisfaction. King of the universe, mighty king, king of Babylon. Here were titles that the Persian conqueror had been eager to make his own. Nevertheless, Mesopotamian tradition had in the long run proven inadequate to the needs of his heirs. The Babylonians, despite all Cyrus's flattering of their pretensions, had only reluctantly accepted their loss of independence. Among the rebels who rose against Darius when 17 years after the fall of Babylon he seized the Persian throne, there was one who claimed to be the son of the city's last native king. Defeated in battle, the wretched man and his lieutenants, as was only to be expected, of course, were all briskly impaled. Darius also made sure, though, to skewer his defeated rival's reputation. Inscriptions broadcast to the world the full scale of the pretender's deceptions. Far from having been a prince of the blood, it was announced, he had not even been a Babylonian, but an Armenian by the name of Araka. He was a liar. This, of all the many accusations that a Persian might level against an adversary, was easily the most damning. The falsehood of which Araka had been convicted was an offence not just against Darius, but against the very stability of the universe. All good and all wise though the Lord Mazda was, his creation, so the Persians believed, was menaced by a darkness to which they gave the name of Drauga, the lie. In fighting Araka and his fellow rebels, Darius had not merely been defending his own interests. Infinitely more had been at stake. The spreading filth of the lie, had it not been purged by Darius, would have ended up splashing the radiance of all that was good with the poison of its sewage. Rebels against his authority as king were also rebels against that of the wise lord. Ignorant of the worship of Ahura Mazda, they had assailed a cosmic order that was synonymous with truth itself. Not for nothing did the Persians use the same word, arta, for them both. Darius, in committing himself to the defence of truth, was setting an example for all who would follow him onto the throne. You who shall be king hereafter, be firmly on your guard against the lie. The man who shall be a follower of the lie, punish him well. And his heirs had done so. Like Darius, they knew themselves engaged in a conflict as old as time and as wide as the universe. Between the light and the darkness, all had to choose their side. There was nothing so tiny, no creeping or coiling thing so insignificant that it might not rank as a minion of the lie. The worms and maggots that fed on a man sentenced to the scaffi, bred of his filth, confirmed by consuming his flesh that both were agents of falsehood and darkness. In a similar manner, those barbarians who lurked beyond the limits of Persian order, where the writ of the great king did not run, were the servants not of gods, but of demons. Naturally, this did not mean blaming foreigners merely because, unlucky not to have been born Persian, they were ignorant of Ahura Mazda. Such a policy would have been grotesque, an offence against all accepted custom. Cyrus, by lavishing patronage on the temples of Babylon, had blazed a path that his heirs made sure to follow. Who was any mortal, even the great king, to mock the gods of other peoples? Nevertheless, as the man charged by Ahura Mazda with the defence of the world against the lie, it was his responsibility to purge strife-torn lands of demons no less than of rebels. Just as Araka had seduced Babylon into revolt by taking on the appearance of their dead king's son, so did demons similarly practice deception by aping the appearance of gods. Faced with such a danger, what recourse did a great king have save to take punitive action? So it was that Darius, looking to the lands beyond his northern frontiers, and alerted to the fractious character of a people named the Scythians, had recognized in their savagery something ominous, a susceptibility to the seductions of demons. They were vulnerable, these Scythians, to the lie, and so Darius, ever the dutiful servant of Ahura Mazda, had made sure to pacify them. In similar manner, after capturing Athens, Xerxes had ordered the temples on the Acropolis be scoured clean with fire, and only then, once he could be certain that they were purged of demons, had he permitted the gods of the city to be offered sacrifice once again. Power such as the great king wielded was something unprecedented. More than any other ruler before him, he was able, by virtue of the sheer immensity of his territorial possessions, to believe himself charged with a universal mission. The word he gave to his empire, Bhumi, was synonymous with the world. The Athenians, when they thought to defy Xerxes' claim to Europe by crucifying one of his servants beside the Hellespont, only confirmed themselves as adherents of the lie. Beyond the physical apparatus of the great king's vast empire, then, beyond the palaces and the barrack rooms and the wayposts on dusty roads, there shimmered a sublime and momentous conceit. The dominion forged by Cyrus and secured by Darius served as a mirror to the heavens. To resist it or to subvert it was to defy truth itself. Never before had a monarchy with ambitions to rule the world endowed its sway with quite so potent an ethical character. The reach of the great king's power, which extended to the limits of east and west, even cast its light into the grave. These are the words of Darius the king, that whosoever worships Ahura Mazda will be blessed with divine favour, both living and dead. Perhaps, as he endured his death agonies, Artaictes was able to find comfort in such a reflection. Certainly the news of his execution would only have confirmed the great king in his disdain for the Athenians as terrorists. Truth or falsehood, light or darkness, order or chaos. These were the choices that humans everywhere had to make. It was a way of comprehending the world that was destined to have an enduring afterlife. Tell me lies. In Athens, of course, they saw things rather differently. In 425 BC, a dramatist by the name of Aristophanes made comic play of just how differently. 54 years had passed since Xerxes put the Acropolis to the torch, and the summit of the rock, cleaned of rubble and adorned with marks and monuments of empire, bore dazzling witness to the scale of the city's revival. Below the Parthenon, largest and most beautiful of the temples that now adorned the Athenian skyline, citizens would gather every winter within the natural curve of the hillside, there to take their seats in a theatre for an annual display of drama. The plays staged in honour of the Lenaea were moved there 2 or 3 decades before Aristophanes' debut. In a year marked by the rhythm of festivals, the Lenaea was a particular celebration of comedy, and Aristophanes, although only at the start of his career, had already proven himself a master of the medium. In 425 he made his debut in the Lenaea with a play, The Acarnanians, that ridiculed everything it touched, and among its targets were the vaunts of the Persian king. He has many eyes. To the Greeks, the claim of their traditional enemy to a universal rule could hardly help but seem sinister in the extreme. Within the limits of his empire, spies were believed to enforce a perpetual surveillance. Everyone feels himself under watch by a king who is omnipresent. Such a target for Aristophanes was too tempting to resist. When the actor given the part of a Persian ambassador in The Acarnanians walked onto the stage, he did so wearing an enormous eye on his head. Invited to deliver the great king's message, he solemnly declaimed a line of gibberish. Even his name, Pseudartabas, was a pointed joke, for just as Arta in Persian meant truth, so did Pseudis in Greek mean lying. Aristophanes could recognize a deserving target when he saw it. Insolently, indomitably, he exposed the profoundest convictions of Darius and his heirs to the laughter of the Athenian crowd. That truth might deceive was a paradox with which the Greeks were well acquainted. In the mountains northwest of Athens, at Delphi, there stood an oracle. and so teasing were its revelations, so ambiguous and riddling its pronouncements, that Apollo, the god who inspired them, was hailed as Loxias, the oblique one. A deity less like Ahura Mazda it would have been hard to imagine. Greek travellers marvelled at peoples in distant lands who obeyed oracles to the letter, for those delivered by Apollo were invariably equivocal. In Delphi, ambivalence was the prerogative of the divine. Apollo, most golden of the gods, who in time would come to be identified with the charioteer of the sun, dazzled those he raped. Famed though he was for his powers of healing and for the magical potency of his musicianship, he was dreaded too as the lord of the silver bow, whose arrows were tipped with plague. Light, which the Persians saw as the animating principle of the universe, wholly good and wholly true, was also the supreme quality of Apollo. But there was a darkness to the Greek god as well. He and his twin sister Artemis, a virgin huntress no less deadly with the bow, were famed for their sensitivity to insult. When a king's daughter named Niobe boasted of how many more children she had than Leto, the mother of Apollo and Artemis, who had only ever had the two, the twin gods exacted a terrible vengeance. A firestorm of golden arrows felled her sons and daughters. For 9 days their corpses lay unburied in their mother's hall, caked with blood. The princess herself, worn to the bone with weeping, took to the hills. There, stuck into stone, Niobe still broods on the spate of griefs the gods poured out to her. How were mortals to avoid offending these capricious and ever status-conscious deities? It was not enough merely to refrain from insulting an immortal's mother. There were dues of sacrifice to be paid, as well as of respect. The bones of animals slaughtered before white-chalked altars, glistening with fat and burned in fires perfumed with incense, were the portion owed the gods. While offerings certainly never guaranteed their favour, failure to make sacrifice was bound to provoke the gods' rage. The risk was one shared by all. No wonder, then, that it should have been the rituals of sacrifice which tended to bring a community most closely together. Men and women, boys and girls, free and slaves, all had their part to play. Festivals, hallowed by time, were hallowed as well by mystery. There were some altars built entirely out of blood, others where no flies ever swarmed around the shambles. The whim of a god was a variable thing, and differed from place to place. In her shrine at Patrae in southern Greece, Artemis demanded a holocaust of living creatures, birds and boars and bears. At Brauron, east of Athens, the robes of women who had died in childbirth. At Sparta, the blood of young men lashed to ribbons. Naturally, with so many different ways of paying the gods what was owed them, and with so many different gods to honour, there was always a nagging anxiety that some might be overlooked. A citizen set the task of collating and inscribing the traditions of Athens, discovered to his horror a long list of sacrifices that everyone had forgotten. The expense of restoring them, so he calculated, would bankrupt the city. The grim truth was that the immortals, with the passage of time, had withdrawn from the company of men, and a golden age become an age of iron. Once, back in the distant past, even Zeus, the king of the gods, who ruled from the heights of Mount Olympus, had delighted in joining the banquets of mortals. Increasingly, though, he had chosen to disguise himself, and to descend from his palace, not to share in a feast, but to rape. Whether as a shower of gold, or as a white bull, or as a swan with beating wings, he had forced himself on a whole succession of women, and thereby bred a race of heroes. Warriors of incomparable prowess, these men had cleansed mountains and swamps of monsters, ventured to the limits of the world, and fathered entire peoples, the noblest and most righteous of generations. The doom of the heroes, when it finally arrived, had proven fully worthy of their peerless stature, for they had been culled in the most renowned and terrible of wars. 10 years it had lasted, and at the end of it, When Troy, the greatest city in Asia, had been left a pile of smoking ruins, few were the victors who had not themselves then succumbed to shipwreck or to murder or to a battalion of sorrows. Justly could it be said of Zeus, "No one is more destructive than you." The fate of Troy never ceased to haunt the Greeks. Even Xerxes, arriving at the Hellespont, had demanded to be shown its site. The Iliad, the poem that enshrined the memory of those who had fought amid the dust of the Trojan plain, also provided the Greeks with their most popular window onto the workings of the gods and of their relationship to mortals. Its author, a man whose dates and place of birth were endlessly debated, was himself a figure touched by a certain quality of the divine. Some went so far as to claim that Homer's father had been a river and his mother a sea nymph. But even those who accepted that his origins had been more mundanely human stood in awe of his achievements. Best and most godlike of all poets, so he was hailed. Never had there been a poem as vivid with a sense of brightness as the Iliad. The play of light was everywhere in its verses. No woman in it was so insignificant that she could not be described as white-armed. No man so fleetingly mentioned that he might not be cast as bronze-armoured. The queen who dressed herself did so by putting on robes that dazzled the eye. The warrior preparing for battle sheathed himself in refulgence brighter than gleaming fire. Beauty was everywhere, and invariably it hinted at violence. To blaze like a golden flame and to attain a godlike pitch of strength and valour, this it was in the Iliad to be most fully a man. Physical perfection and moral superiority were indissoluble. This was the assumption. On the battlefield at Troy, only the base were ugly. Such men might on occasion merit being mocked and beaten, but they were hardly fitting opponents of a hero. The surest measure of greatness was in a contest worthy of the name, an agon. This was why, in the fighting between Greek and Trojan, the gods themselves would sometimes descend onto the battlefield, not merely to watch the serried lines of men, their shields and armour glinting as they moved in for the kill, but to fight in the cause of their favourites. And whenever they alighted, they would quiver with anticipation like nervous doves. It was why, as well, sitting in their golden halls, the gods might not hesitate to sacrifice whole cities and peoples to their enmities. When Hera, the queen of the gods, demanded of her husband that he surrender Troy, which he loved above all other cities, to her quenchless hatred, and Zeus demurred, she refused to cede the field. "The three cities that I love best of all are Argos and Sparta, Mycenae, with streets as broad as Troy's. Raise them, whenever they stir the hatred in your heart." What mattered was victory, not the cost. This spirit, this ferocious commitment to being the best, was one in which all aspired to share. In Homer's poetry, the word for prey, eukomai, was also a word for boast. The gods invariably looked with favour upon an agon. Rare was the sanctuary that did not serve as the venue for some competition, be it for dancers, poets, or weavers. From athletics to beauty contests, all had their divine sponsors. When Aristophanes wrote the Acharnians, he did so as a contender in an agon. The Lenaea was held in honour of Dionysus, a god whose fondness for drunken revelry and female company rendered him a more than appropriate patron for Aristophanes' brand of comedy. Kings and princes, of the kind who on the plain of Troy had dared to fight even with gods, no longer reigned in Athens. Less than a century before the time of Aristophanes, revolution had come to the city, and a radically new form of government, one in which power was entrusted to the people, been enshrined there. In a democracy, the right to contend with one's peers was no longer the prerogative of aristocrats alone. Indeed, the ethos of gods and heroes might come to seem, when viewed through the prism of a more egalitarian age, more than a little comic. Aristophanes, who was nothing if not competitive himself, did not hesitate to portray them as oafs or cowards or liars. In one of his comedies, he even dared to show Dionysus, disguised as a slave, shitting himself as he was threatened with torture and then being scourged with a whip. The play, like the Acharnians, was awarded first prize. The tension, though, between ancient song and the values of those who were not heroes was never simply a matter for laughter. Are there no guidelines set by heaven for mortal men, no path to follow that will please the gods? This question, which the sick, the bereaved, or the oppressed could hardly help but ask, had no ready answer. The gods, inscrutable and whimsical as they were, rarely deigned to explain themselves. They certainly never thought to regulate morals. The oracle at Delphi might offer advice, but not ethical instruction. The god does not rule by issuing commands. Such guidelines as mortal men had set for them derived from tradition, not revelation. Law was so dependent on custom as to be indistinguishable from it. With the coming of democracy, though, that assumption was challenged. The right of the people to determine legislation emerged as something fundamental to their authority. For everyone would agree that it is the city's laws which are chiefly responsible for its prosperity, its democracy, and its freedom. Only in the assemblies, where citizens met as equals to deliberate and vote, was there to be found a source of legitimacy appropriate to the rule of Athens by the people. What value liberty otherwise? Nevertheless, the Athenians could not help but be nagged at by certain anxiety. To submit themselves to laws of human origin was to run the risk of tyranny. For what was to stop an overambitious citizen from framing legislation designed to subvert the democracy?